Welcome, everybody. My name is Roxanne Marcello. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a research associate with CORE and a Data for Change team member. We just want to let folks know that this webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with others who can't attend today, and it can also be a resource for everyone if you want to look back on it. So this is our introduction to data visualization, and we can go to the next slide. The objectives for today that we're hoping you'll learn how to transform your data into clear and effective data visualizations using design principles, 3 of which we'll go over later in the webinar. Also hoping you'll understand why and when to use certain types of charts, and then an opportunity to explore various examples of data visualizations and learn how to distinguish between effective and ineffective ones. Next slide. Back one. Thanks. So we're going to just do our welcome and some introductions, and then we'll dive into understanding your audience and data, which is an important piece before you move into selecting chart types. We'll also go over those design principles I mentioned. Closer to the end, we'll have a short demonstration that Apoorva will lead in Excel, where we'll go through how to make a chart and apply the design principles we've talked about. And then we'll have some breakout rooms at the end with a little bit of time for some small discussion. So, and then we'll close things out. We can go to the next slide. So before we get into the real content here about data visualization, we wanted to spend a little time acknowledging our context. And we know that the current times that we're in around the world and our nation just hold a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for folks. And so we just wanted to A, acknowledge that, but B, mention that like one of the purposes of these Data for Change spaces, our webinars and the Data Summit and other things, is an opportunity to bring community together and just realize that we're not doing this alone. We have folks that we can rely on. We can connect and build community together. And drive improvement together. And so we just wanted to make sure we mention that. We also wanted to share a brief land acknowledgement. So today we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today, including the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molalla tribes. We know that land acknowledgement alone isn't enough, so we have a couple of examples of how you can act. We generally include this in our webinars, so we have it here today. We also wanted to recognize Women's History Month because March is Women's History Month, and it's a time to recognize the vital role of women in American history and an opportunity to uplift all women today. We also have some examples of ways to engage in Women's History Month, such as participating in the Smithsonian Wikipedia Editathon, which is an opportunity to make more women's stories available and visible online. Next slide. So in the chat, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves, you can add your name and pronouns, your organization, and then the Indigenous lands that you are currently on. And if you're not sure which lands you're on, you can use the website there. I believe we can drop that link in the chat so folks can click on the link, and then you can type in your zip code, I'm pretty sure, and it'll let you know where you are. Thanks, Taylor, for dropping that in. We can go to the next slide while people are introducing themselves. I will keep chatting away. You can go back one. Thanks. So we have some upcoming Data for Change events. We have our final webinar in this 3-month series. It's coming up on April 17th. It's also a Thursday from 9 to 10 a.m. And then on June 6th, we have our 3rd annual Data for Change Data Summit. I know I sound kind of nerdy, but I'm really excited about it, actually. We've done it the past couple of years, so this year should be great. I think Abby sent a little bit of information about it via email a couple days ago, but we'll send more information in the coming weeks. Again, that's June 6th from 9 to 3, and we'll have some really great sessions and seminars and opportunities to network. So thanks everyone for starting to introduce yourselves in the chat. Hi, Salem. Hi, Melissa. All right, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So we wanted to do a quick check-in just to see what everyone is like kind of feeling when they think about data visualization. So if we click ahead, we wanted to ask folks, what do you think of when you hear the words data visualization? So I believe you should get a pop-up on your screen that prompts you to, yeah, I think, perfect. Looks like there's a poll there. So you can just enter anything you think of when you hear the word data visualization. I'll give everyone a few moments. All right, we have charts and graphs, dashboards, fun graphs, graphics. I love it. Yeah, that's readability, pie charts. Okay. Can everyone see the word cloud or is it just me? I want to make sure. Yeah, okay, cool. I'm glad everyone else can see it. All right. Looks like communication, readability. I love this. Thanks everybody for answering. All right, I'm going to close that poll. But I'm glad to see what everybody's thinking. We also wanted to check in, if you want to skip ahead, Apurva, to ask about if you create data visualizations. We know not everybody here does, but if you do, or you know someone who does, or whatnot, we wanted to ask like who your typical audience for data visualizations are. And I think we're just going to put those answers in the chat. So as people are introducing themselves, you can also go ahead and answer this question. Some people create data viz for sharing information with funders. Some want to share information back with their community members or clients. Sometimes they just want to share it with the broader public. So there's lots of different audiences. You can just pop that in. Pop your answers in the chat whenever you feel like it. All right, we can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, internal teams, external teams, funders. Okay, lots of people, stakeholders, funders in our board, individual donors, and social media. Oh, social media, yep, that is definitely a big one. Grant funders. Okay, awesome. Thanks for sharing, everybody. So we know that data visualizations come in all different sizes, shapes, colors, and formats. We all have lived experience in seeing them in our day-to-day lives. And data viz, as I'll shorten it, is a graphical representation of information and data. They're helpful ways of exploring complex patterns or large quantities of data that maybe aren't as easily understood if you're just like reading a lot of text. So if you have data and you're like writing out long paragraphs of text, sometimes it can be hard for the reader or viewer to digest. So it's nice to have data viz to help people like see the information in a different way. And within a data life cycle, which we have depicted on like the right-hand side in that graphic, data visualization, that piece comes towards the end of the overall cycle. So you have like the people that you're collecting the data from, then you have your data, maybe is all jumbled up, and then you sort it, kind of like you might sort and clean it like Taylor did in our last webinar. And then you might arrange it, which you could arrange it into like a pivot table, kind of like Claire did during our last webinar. And then you would figure out how you want to present it visually. Hopefully you're sharing a story with that. And then maybe there's even some actionable steps that come from that. But generally speaking, the data viz part comes later in the data cycle. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And there are a few things to consider before diving into specifics about like designing effective data visualization. So we will talk about like the specific pieces of data viz, but we wanted to include that it's important to know and understand your audience and your data before you even begin designing data viz. So we can go to the next slide. So to start, you really want to think about who will be looking at your data viz. Like what information do they need? What information do they already have? What information are they maybe expecting? And how much time do they have to review the visuals? Is this someone who's maybe on LinkedIn and scrolling by and you have about 5 seconds to grab their attention? Or is this someone who's sitting down with your annual report and really invested a little bit, have more time to invest? These visualizations are going to look different. You also want to think about how your chart and data viz are going to add value for the audience. And if you can't think of a way that your chart will add value for the audience, then don't make one. You don't always have to make one if you have data that you're sharing. Every chart needs a purpose and a so what. And context matters, and all of these pieces really should inform your design before you even get into the design process. Next slide. So once you think about your audience and their needs, you'll also want to consider a few concepts that will help you like continue to frame your data story. So this graphic is from We All Count, which is a project in for equity in data science. And they consider this intersection point of content, medium, and access to be the point that will work best for your audience. So you identify your audience and then you figure out what's the content, and that's content is just like what's included and how is it said. Then you have medium, which is the form of communication. This is like the graph, table, infographic. It could also be like, is this data or print, or not data, losing my words here, but is it print or like online? And then access is how easily and completely your audience can engage and understand. So thinking about those three pieces in conjunction with the audience that you've identified and their specific needs, that's what's going to work for your audience. And just a note on access. So the visual here, the people that developed this probably could have rethought this yellow text on the bottom on the beige background, because that color is actually not super accessible for reading. So we just wanted to share that this is like a real life example of something you could consider when you're developing your data viz. And we'll talk about color later on in the webinar, but I just wanted to point that out. You can go to the next slide. So we know that, not only is understanding your audience a crucial piece of framing your data story, but understanding your data is obviously important too. So before you start developing your data visualization, it's important to keep in mind that your data likely come from people, and those people are real, they have real experiences and real needs, and you are most likely speaking on behalf of them by like through the data visualization. So you really just want to think about that and also consider the questions on this slide. Think about how the data were collected, why they were collected, and who is and is not reflected in the data. Whose voices, lives, and experiences are missing or maybe being over included. And thinking through these pieces may just help you mitigate causing any like unintentional harm. An example of harm, just so folks are on the same page, is like maybe someone's identity could be exposed or disclosed because you use a really small data set, and that one person has a very different experience or a very different story that they shared from the rest of the group, and they could, potentially be identified. So just thinking about those pieces before you develop your data viz and share that information out with the broader public is really important. So we just wanted to bring that point up. Next slide. I just have a few more slides and then I'll pass it over to Chow. So data can be framed in various ways, of course, and the choices we make in our data viz can really influence how they're interpreted. So oftentimes there's a working assumption that using a visually plain style really lets the viewer like draw their own conclusion. But we know that data is not objective and it's not neutral. So even the plainest or most neutral way of depicting your data can actually unintentionally bolster the dominant group narrative. And the way that we display and depict data changes the way that people interpret it. So in the example here, on the right-hand side, the data that's being shown is actually the same, but how it's been visually presented is different and it tells a different story. So these were created by the New York Times. The top one's from the perspective of Democrats and the lower one is from the perspective of Republicans. And either one on its own feels like it's like a totally neutral and factual, data piece of data viz. But we know that it's not really neutral and it's only a partial perspective. So the way that you depict your data really can have an influence on how people are understanding it and interpreting it. We'll go to the next slide. So the other piece besides, well, this is another example of how data can be framed, but in this example, we're showing how text can be used to influence our interpretation. So looking at the title for the example on the left-hand side, um, it says mental health in jail, which feels like it's like very neutral and, straightforward, but it doesn't actually show the true disparity that's actually occurring in the study that was done. So the study found that there was, evidence that diagnosis numbers shouldn't really be trusted due to racial and ethnic discrimination. And so that's not really being communicated in that left-hand side title, mental health in jail. So changing it to the right-hand side, racism in jail, shares a different story and better provides more context for the data. So the data itself in the two charts is exactly the same, but the story kind of changes with the way you're using your language and the text. And you could stop here with this right-hand one. It says racism in jail, people of color less likely to get mental health diagnoses. But if you skip ahead one more slide, this one is racism in jail. It has the same title, but the subtitle, white people get more mental health diagnoses, tells an even bigger story, and it continues to bring you along on that journey. So we just wanted to make sure folks understood this. Like, my main take home point from these couple slides is that it's really important to be clear with the language you choose to use and how you visually depict your data, because text and visual elements can be as persuasive as the actual like info and data itself. So I will stop talking now and I'm going to pass it over to Chow, who's our guest presenter. Thanks, Chow, for being here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks so much. And thank you for that useful overview. You know, we talk about data visualizations, and rarely do we see data visualizations by themselves. They're always embedded in some sort of context. So it's a great reminder to know that like any explanatory text or labels really do contribute to the audience's experience of those visuals. We're going to kind of peel back the layers and go directly to the visuals themselves in this segment. Next slide, please. So our survey of different visualization types will start with bar charts. Everyone's seen bar charts, and for many of us, I think bar charts are the first data visuals that we had come across. I remember in elementary school taking a sheet of graph paper and filling in the squares based on the numbers that we were seeing on the worksheet and making our very first bar charts. A few things that I mean, they're basic, everyone knows them. I'll point out a few things that are useful considerations when constructing these bar charts. The first of which is labels. This particular example, they don't have the labels here, but in the last example we saw, the labels were arranged horizontally and the bars were going up and down. So in some cases, you might have skinny bars, you might have long labels, and so the readability of those labels can be affected. Some people like to angle the labels so that they're at 45 degrees, or they might make them vertical. I kind of feel like those are less readable. So at core, what we prefer is to have the bars going left to right so that the labels can also take up as much space as they need, and they don't need so much uh, formatting or kind of fiddling with. So having the bars in the same direction as you read is really handy. Um, Another thing that we like to point out is these examples here have little axes for the numbers. In general, we like to have the numbers next to the bars, and then you don't have to have the axes in the chart. And this is something that we'll talk about later called the data to ink ratio. In general, sort of to sum up, bar charts are great for between group comparisons. And one last thing that I did want to point out before I move on is the sorting of bars. So in this case, both of these examples, the bars are sorted by length. And in some situations, you might want to uh, reconsider that. I think that in a lot of cases, having it sorted by size is great because it presents a nice sort of data shape for your audience to look at. But in some situations, you may want to rethink that, especially when it comes to certain demographic charts. So if you're producing a chart based on race and ethnicity or language spoken, you might want to consider the narrative that is promoting. So if you have, say, English language first, that is the most commonly spoken language in a lot of cases in our country. It's not always, though. So um, that is something that you really want to consider is do you want to put that group first always? Maybe not. The situation, if you have that at your disposal, this technique at your disposal, something that we've done is we've allowed folks to choose how to sort the bars so that it's not always, so that you can kind of view the data shape, quote unquote, in different ways. Um, so bar charts, basic, yes, but there's a lot of room for kind of fiddling with it and changing how your audience experiences that bar chart. Next slide, please. Variation on the basic bar chart that a lot of folks have also seen are grouped bars. So this is useful if you want to add a level of detail. Um, and this is something that's great if you want to sort of compare parts to whole. Another option or another reason you might do grouped bars is that you want to have subgroup comparisons by time. So in the context of, say, a business, you might have different business divisions and quarters over time. So one of the key decision points that you might want to make is how to group the bars. So in some cases, you might want to make the groups divisions and then have the quarters be the larger groups. And then the other option is to have each group be a division and then the bars, individual bars be a quarter. So it really depends on what comparison you want the audience to see first. Um, so if you want to highlight, for instance, a individual quarterly change, like if there's overall quarterly trends upwards, then you might have the larger grouping be divisions. It really depends on what the story is that you're trying to tell. Another kind of guideline that I would offer for group bars is to limit the number of groups. If you have extremely large groups, that makes the readability of the chart somewhat difficult, I think. 4 to 5 might be kind of a good max number, but play around and see how that works for you. It becomes a lot more challenging too, I think, if you have to have a complicated legend for folks to look at. A principle that I kind of informally think of is called like eye hopping. So if you have to like hop your eye across the page to refer to something else. So for instance, if you have a legend, you have to hop back and forth, your eye has to hop back and forth. That can be a little bit, it's a little bit of a pain point for your audience. So if you kind of want to minimize that if possible. Next slide, please. Stacked bar charts are good for visualizing parts to whole. And in this case, we have multiple stacked bar charts. This is a great way to represent different proportions of a whole over time. In this case, the stacked bars, the overall length of the bar kind of represents the total quantity that you're measuring over time. An alternative to this is to keep all of the lengths at 100% and just have the stacked bars represent the different percentages over time. The main pitfall of these stacked bar charts, whether it's a single bar or multiple bars over time, is that it's difficult to visually compare subgroups. It can be difficult to compare subgroups if you have more than, say, 4 groups. Too many small slices makes it really hard to read. Also, if you notice, say, if you wanted to track the performance or the change over time of, say, the middle group, then it can be a little bit challenging because they're not aligned on the same baseline. So comparing those lengths of those floating bars can be a little bit tricky. So in this case, you might opt for a grouped bar chart instead. But it can be still have usefulness if you're trying to see at a glance the proportions over time. So next slide, please. Line graphs are used primarily for visualizing data over time. This is another very common visualization. You could do this as a bar chart, but then you have this sort of confounding effect where the color of the bars might influence your visual interpretation of the chart. So it's nice to have the line stand out. The main pitfall of line charts, there's a couple that I'll point out. First of all, you want to pay attention to the height versus the width. I've seen line charts where the width is stretched out so wide that the line is super flat, and that kind of limits the usefulness of the line graph. So you want to aim for something it could be square, or it could be, maybe no more than like a proportion of 1 to 3, but you want to be able to see meaningful contours in the line graph, and you don't want it to be super flat. A lot of folks put multiple lines on a single chart, and that's fine. Again, similar to the stacked bar charts or the grouped bar charts, you don't want to have too many lines, or else it starts to end up looking like a plate of spaghetti. Unless you have lines that really don't overlap, you kind of want to keep the number of lines limited. Next slide, please. So we haven't mentioned pie charts. And pie charts are have fallen kind of out of fashion amongst the professional data visualization community. One of the main reasons being that it's harder for folks to compare the size of pie slices relative to bars. The length of bars lets you see subtle differences way more easily, as you can see in this example. So another pitfall for pie slices, just like with the group bar charts and stacked bar charts and line charts, a lot of bad pie charts that I've seen have involved the use of too many tiny slices, and it becomes starts to look like a pizza that's been cut up into too many small slices. So really, if you had to use pie charts, it's best to limit it to, say, no more than 4 slices. So next slide, please. Thanks, Roxanne, for pointing that out. And so what we prefer, if you need to use something like a pie chart, is a donut plot. And I think that a donut plot with 2 groups is a great way to illustrate proportions, especially if you're trying to present KPIs. You can put the KPI of the relevant group in the middle, and you can have a number of these as a sort of arrayed across the top of a report, and that becomes an impactful visual element. As Noah was pointing out, yeah, just 2 groups is okay. I think donuts are a little bit nicer just because then you have that extra KPI in the donut hole, which gives a little bit more visual impact. So it's clear. It should be clear which portion is being highlighted with the KPI. In this example, we matched the number with the slice of the pie, and also making the relevant number a lot more dark. So that helps. All right, next slide, please. So to really kind of make the data even more visually understandable, we are introducing a few design principles to help you when you think about constructing your chart. Next slide, please. So the three main principles that we want to highlight for you today are to think about the visual hierarchy. Related to the visual hierarchy is the data ink ratio, and then finally the use of color.
Awesome.
Next slide, please. So for visual hierarchy, I kind of want to let you all imagine a newspaper or a website that is all in the same sized font, no headlines or anything like that. It becomes really difficult to pick out where section divisions are and what's most important. So the idea of visual hierarchy is to use graphical elements to draw the reader's attention to either division breaks or important context. And it's to show things in the order of importance: headlines, section headers, body paragraphs, charts, figures. Those are all formatted differently so that your eye has structure, your visual system has structure to kind of begin to approach a document. And you can do this with different ways. In this example here, you can see these are the common ways to show visual hierarchy: scale, contrast, direction, and position. All of those are used to provide visual breaks and waypoints for your eyes to kind of follow to make sense of a document. And this is definitely true for charts as well. Next slide, please. So in how this shows up in visualization is what's called the data to ink ratio. So data ink is like the bar in the bar chart, the line in the line graph, the pie slice. These are the things that your numbers are being represented as graphical elements. And those are the things that are non-negotiable. They have to show up. Data ink is everything else that kind of provides context for those graphical elements. They could be data labels, they could be axes, they can be reference lines and the like. Next slide, please. So we have two examples here. They show the same data. On the left side, we have this is a Microsoft default, I think. And then on the right side is a cleaned up version. So what we want to do is we want to erase the non-data ink. In this case, it would be the bounding box. It would be the reference lines. You might have some extraneous labels. So for instance, accidents by area, and then you have you also have this axis label, number of accidents with the numbers by it on top of this bar chart on the left. You have region on the left here. So those are kind of redundant. So we can remove those from the chart and we end up with the one on the right, and it becomes a lot cleaner and easier to read, in my opinion. And you don't need the axes numbers because you have the data labels, and then you don't need to worry about the axis label region because it says accidents by area. Next slide, please. So we want to erase the data label within the data ink ratio, like non-data ink within reason. So we have this bar chart on the left, and it's got all the lines and the axes. This was taken from an academic book on data visualization. And while the chart on the right shows the same data, it's kind of wacky looking to me, and no one's going to really like encounter this in, say, a newspaper or website. It's pretty weird looking. So, when we say erase data ink ratio, you want to not embrace too much, or else you end up with a chart that looks kind of funny. Next slide, please. Color is a topic in and of itself. You could have an entire talk devoted to color. So the points that we want to highlight quickly are to make sure that the use of color is meaningful. We want to make sure that you're paying attention to color-blind palettes and readability. More than 4 to 5 colors can be hard to read. I think that we're seeing a theme here that if you have too many groups, bars can be hard to read. If you have too many pie slices, it can be hard to read. More than 5 colors can be hard to read, and this is true for both across hues, so having a red, green, yellow, purple, etc., or having 5 shades of green. More than that can be challenging to read. Paying attention to cultural connotations and colors is also something that you want to pay attention to. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on in our demo. Next slide, please. Another thing that we want to pay attention to is if you choose to use a legend, you want to make sure that the legend minimizes that eye-hopping principle that I mentioned earlier. So if you look at this slide here, you see that the color legend is, I think it's arranged, yeah, it's arranged alphabetically, but if you look at the order of the lines, the color of the lines are different from the way that it shows up in the legend. And that's not super helpful. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit better. You match the legend order with the data order. You still have a little bit of eye hopping. The person who made this chart, you can put the labels right next to the end of the lines too, if you want. And that makes it even more easy, and it minimizes the eye hopping even more. Next slide, please. To sum up, we want to have this little data cheat sheet here. You want to know your audience, you want to know your data, you want to keep things simple, you want to use the right chart type for the key comparisons that you want to highlight. You want to highlight the most important information using visual hierarchy, and along with that to avoid clutter, which means removing as much data ink ratio as feasible, and to use those colors wisely. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to take us into a quick demo in Excel now, how to put together all the principles that we've talked about today in the actual making of a chart. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and start sharing an Excel sheet. So give me a thumbs up if you can see that once you can see it. Awesome. Okay. So if you attended our last webinar on data, then maybe some of this looks familiar. This is the exact Excel sheet that Taylor and Claire were working with. So what I'm going to do is look at these pivot tables that were created and make a chart out of this one right here. First thing I'm going to do is make an additional tab to put our charts into, just to make it a little easier to see. So the second thing is to look at this table and understand what story I want to tell with the data in here. So this shows me the total count of people who responded with what level of satisfaction they had with the program. And it also shows the count by gender identity. So I'm trying to compare total counts within a category. So to do that, I think the chart that I want to use is the stacked bar chart that Chow just talked about. So to make the actual chart, first I right click inside the table, then I go up to this bar at the top and I click on insert. That'll pop up this little charts option here. And if I click on recommended charts, I can look at, so these are the vertical column charts, but I know that horizontal charts are a little bit easier to read. So I'll click on that option. So there's a clustered bar, there's a stacked bar, and I think that the stacked bar is what I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And that'll pop it up right here. Now it's a little bit hard to see on this tab, so I'm going to move it over to the charts tab that we created by right-clicking inside the chart and moving down to this button here that says Move Chart. When I select that, I can move it to another sheet within this Excel document. So I'm going to click on Charts, and it'll move us here. And this makes it a little bit easier to see. Let's apply some of the data visualization principles we just talked about. One of them is the text elements. So I see that we have a legend, which is really helpful. I see that we don't have a chart title and we don't have a label for this bottom axis here. I don't think we need a label for the very dissatisfied to very satisfied. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So maybe the chart elements that I want to add are a chart title and then a label title for this. So to do that, I will go up to this button here that says Design in green, and that'll open up this over on the left side that says Add Chart Element. So when I click on that dropdown, I can choose to add a chart title. Currently, you can see that the none is grayed out, which means that there's no chart title selected, but I can add a chart title above. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to call this program satisfaction by gender identity. The next piece I want to add is that label for that bottom axis. So go back to add chart element. There are axis titles. I don't want the horizontal, or I don't want the vertical one. I just want the horizontal. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and then I can edit that to be count of response. So now thinking about the other data visualization principles that Chad talked about, I have the grid lines here, which is that non-data ink that we want to remove. I have these labels here that I want to remove, and I have all this blank space in between each bar. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the grid lines. That'll go back to this add chart element. And I select grid lines. Currently, primary, major, vertical is selected, so I'll just unselect that, and that'll remove those grid lines. I want to remove these buttons, which came from the pivot table. So that will, when I select that, I can go up to this tab here that says Pivot Chart Analyze, and you see that field buttons are selected. So I can go ahead and hide all of those, and that'll clear up a little bit of space for us. And then what I want to do is think about these blank spaces here. So to do that, I'm going to right click inside that bar, and it says Format Data Series. And that'll take us over to this right-hand side here, which is the Format toolbar, which is a really important tool in the creation of charts. So I look at these gaps here, and that is the gap width that's shown here. It's currently at 150%, which means 1.5 times the size of the bar. So I'm going to lower that to something like 30%, which makes it a little bit easier to see. And that removes some of that blank space in between. Now, the final thing that I want to do is think about the colors that are used here. We talked about use of color judiciously. Some of that is cultural connotations. Some of that might also be branding. And then the other piece that might be is we want to look at how do I tell the story. So looking at these bars here, I want to add maybe some data labels in to make it a little bit easier to tell how many people are represented by each of these bars. So I'll go back to design, go back to add chart element, and add data labels on the inside end. So as you can see with the colors that I've currently chosen, it's really hard to tell what those numbers look like. So I want to change the color, 1, to make it more readable, 2, to maybe match the branding of my organization, and 3, to make sure that I'm not making any cultural connotations or context that might distract from the story I'm trying to tell with this data. So first I think about what are the colors here and what is the story that I'm telling. So this is program satisfaction by gender identity. And I know that in certain cultures, the colors blue and red can be associated with certain genders. So I want to remove all of those associations while also making it easy to read the number inside. So I'm going to right click on that blue bar, and I'm going to click on this paint bucket that says fill. And I'm going to select maybe this fun purple. And for the red, I'll do the same. I'm going to right click, select fill, and then pick this lighter colored orange. Now, one thing I notice is that the green is a heavier weight than the other two colors. So I'm going to adjust that one as well. The color is fine. I just want it to be a little bit lighter. So I will select that. Now the numbers are a little bit easier to read. The colors are no longer associated with anything. And I can look at this chart and I can get a better sense of the story that it's trying to tell. So this is a very, very rapid way of looking at the principles that we talked about today. I just wanted to show you how easy it is to use some of these tools in Excel to make some of these adjustments and maybe help get you started thinking about what you might want to do as we go into our examples of things that you might want to change or things that you might do better if you were to make a chart with the data given. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to our slides. Okay. And this takes us to our big take-home message, which was avoid the Microsoft default styles, or at least modify them so the chart is listed. And I'm going to hand it back over to Chao to take us through what that means.
Yeah, essentially, a lot of the reason why charts might look gross is because folks have made them in Microsoft or Google Sheets and not bothered to put their own personal spin on them. What we want to do is we want to avoid default styles. If your organization has a communications department, you can work with them to kind of get the appropriate color palette, fonts, and visual branding that you can so you can make the chart look your own. And here I'll just give you a quick rundown here of some of the gross Microsoft's like prepackaged styles here. You know, click through this one, and then this one, and then this one. And all of these examples kind of have like a lot of extra visual fluff that makes the chart just look like slightly less readable and frankly kind of gross looking to my eyes, at least. You know, taste is in the eye of the beholder, but they all contain a lot of extra stuff that's not needed. Now, again, I'll highlight this again. If your org has a branding department or a design, you're working with a designer, please engage with them, get their input, and you know, produce the charts of your dreams that will look on brand and convey the message that you want.